It's hard for me to will myself to create a video series such as this. However, I think after the past few major releases with Final Fantasy, it's time to talk about Square's continuous failure to live up to its own name. Final Fantasy used to be a system seller. It used to be that if a Final Fantasy was being released, everyone was talking about it. There was insane hype around Final Fantasy or any Square game. It was crazy to think that Nintendo actually worked together with Square to create Super Mario RPG. It was such a bizarre idea at the time considering that Mario was a platforming franchise, but look at what Square essentially created: the Mario and Luigi saga and the Paper Mario series. Square was this powerhouse of gaming. Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy were flagship games for consoles that people loved. Even Enix created Dragon Quest, which is also a fan favorite in Japan. Sure, nostalgia can really blind some people, but there really is a stark difference between the Final Fantasies of today versus the Final Fantasies of the late 80s to early millennium. From thematics to the oversaturation of spin-offs, their abuse of Final Fantasy VII, to ignoring two of their most famous titles, Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI, the recent lack of distinct and memorable characters, bad voice acting, the reinvention of combat constantly, the convoluted storytelling, the Final Fantasy XIV debacle. I could go on with the countless problems that this company has produced, and I will, because apparently complaining is what I do best. My name's Basil, and let's look into what ruined Final Fantasy. While Final Fantasy may be anything but final, given the fact that the series has spawned more games than most other RPG franchises, the games have always been heavily rooted in swords and sorcery high fantasy, or at least they were. Recent Final Fantasy installments have decided to take a different direction, where it has become normative to mix futuristic weaponry with blades and spells. It started off as a gradual progression. Games like Final Fantasy VI and VII respectively tried to incorporate steampunk and cyberpunk thematic elements that gave them a distinct feeling from their predecessors. I don't think Final Fantasy needed to strictly adhere to being medieval. Final Fantasy games had come out in relatively quick succession, so the need to creatively experiment with the series was entirely merited in our opinion. However, a game franchise simply cannot stray too far from its roots before it begins to alienate its fans. After 6 and 7, Final Fantasy now had mechs and guns, yet they still felt like appropriate Final Fantasy games with a new flavorful twist. Final Fantasy VIII integrated even more technology into its universe, and sadly over time, this trend has snowballed out of control. It's not that technology has no place in Final Fantasy, it's just that technology has become completely and utterly dominant. In my opinion, Final Fantasy IX was the last Final Fantasy game that closely identified with the swords and sorcery games of old. The games that the series owes its success to. Again, there's nothing wrong with technology being featured in the Final Fantasy universe, but this is how it's been for 2 decades now, with no signs of ever stopping from Square. I understand that there are some people out there that really enjoy the futuristic direction that Final Fantasy has taken. From my understanding, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy was much more appreciated by Japanese audience than it was in the West. However, for many of us, the newer Final Fantasy games have strayed entirely too far away from what they originally were. To continue with another major problem with particularly recent Final Fantasies, at least in my eyes, is the hyper-realism. It has gone off the deep end. Not only are newer Final Fantasies harder to relate to, they are also expensive, and development time has seriously suffered as a result. I can remember a time back when Final Fantasy XIII was in development, hearing about it in its brother games, Final Fantasy XIII Versus and Final Fantasy Agito. At the time, this was a huge lineup of Final Fantasy content. I could hardly contain myself. Well, besides the fact that many in the end didn't like Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIII Versus was released in 2017, 8 years later. That is an absolutely insane amount of time. Renamed as Final Fantasy XV and probably reworked countless times, we got again a game that was hyper-realistic with an unrelatable cast that for the most part lacked severely in the Final Fantasy charms of old. Although I have heard of the brotherly love that Final Fantasy XV featured, it's hard to get into. Square has seriously dragged their feet through the mud with new releases. The time span between Final Fantasy releases has grown so much that I hardly think about the games anymore. Yes, they've re-released games in the past decade, which is also a problem on its own, but now that amount of time between new Final Fantasies is so large, new gamers are not being exposed to it, so is it worth it to expend all this effort to make every dang strand of hair on Noctis' head visible, or to have every pore in his face shine in the sun? No, it's not worth it. There's nothing distinct about them, there's nothing memorable about the characters, and it becomes so hard to relate to them. And let's touch upon another famous series, the Zelda series. Their newest game, Breath of the Wild, is absolutely gorgeous. Despite its shaky frame rate and other graphical limitations, it is renowned as a visual spectacle despite it not venturing into hyper-realism. Let's not forget that there isn't an 8-year gap between Zelda releases as well. All the while, we received numerous HD remasters and 3DS releases that took a lot of time and effort to create from Nintendo, and this isn't even mentioning the other famous titles that Nintendo manages to pump out year after year. Can I ask Square one question? Out of all the remasters, all the releases, why are you sitting on Final Fantasy VI and doing nothing with it? I get that you're busy with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I'm super excited for, but my god, get a grip! Look at this! Awful. Tetsuya Nomura is the man in charge when it comes to character design in Final Fantasy, and man, has he gone off his rocker recently. Since the beginning, the series has always been no stranger to rather eccentric looking characters. Look at Cecil, for example. Even back then, he looked pretty ridiculous. However, the 8 and 16-bit installments usually left some of this to your imagination. In the later Final Fantasy games, the characters completely spiraled out of control as technology allowed Nomura's heinous designs to be fully realized in 3D. It cannot be stated enough. It feels like Square has put more effort into how pretty the characters can look instead of just making an enjoyable game experience. And I use the word pretty intentionally here. It feels like every Final Fantasy game since 8, excluding Final Fantasy 9, has taken this artistic direction where every single character's face looks the same. Perfect eyes, perfect hair, perfect everything. It's like if you removed their hair, you wouldn't even be able to recognize or identify any of the characters just looking at their faces. This homogenized design is just unappealing. They even used it in the FF4 DS remake. Look at how the characters look in the cutscenes compared to how they look in-game. And oh god, don't even get us started on some of the outfits these characters wear. I'm looking at you, Vaughn, Titus, and Advent Children Cloud, and many others. It's just an absolute eyesore. There's something to be said about simplicity when it comes to creating memorable characters. Look at the original Final Fantasy VII Cloud versus Advent Children Cloud. All the belts and zippers and hairspray, yes, Jimquisition, you are 100% correct on this one, and needless detail have simply got to go if you want us to ever take some of these characters seriously. We need more of the Cids, Yangs, Barretts, and Steiners. These are the kind of characters that are relatable, memorable, and stick with you. What about the Katesiths, Red 13s, Quinnas, and Vivis? These characters are uniquely designed to look different and grab your attention, but furthermore, they prove that looks are deceiving and there's more to them than meets the eye. I just have to ask, why are we stuck with exclusively beautiful characters? They've been plaguing the series forever now. How memorable a character is ultimately revolves around the game's approach to storytelling, something that FF12 actually struggled with sometimes, and I think it may be an issue when your game doesn't even have a true main character. Yes, I know, Final Fantasy VI, you'll be okay. Vaughn is unremarkable, unrelatable, and generally uninteresting, and this sentiment extends into the game's entire cast, maybe besides Balthier. And then there's Final Fantasy XIII, and it isn't that I'm having some sort of lapse in memory, but I can't really recall any single plot point from the convoluted mess that was Final Fantasy XIII after playing it quite extensively. I played the game only 7 years ago, and I can't remember a single thing about any of the characters or the world they lived in. Maybe if they didn't put so much attention into rendering every strand of hair on Lightning's head, they'd have remembered to actually give her an interesting story. I played 13 at the height of my Final Fantasy fandom, getting many of my friends into the series themselves, and even back then I knew it was hot garbage filled with terrible writing and stupid characters. Lassie, Fallacy, melodrama, all these characters are just the worst sometimes. To push this even further, Square had to go at the series 3 separate times. Considering this game's divisiveness, it just doesn't make sense to abuse their fanbase and continue adding to what was already a detriment to the Final Fantasy franchise instead of focusing on other new games. Let's talk about the combat of the Final Fantasy franchise for a bit, and while I can't complain about every combat system that they've ever created, I can certainly attack their unsatiated lust for reinventing it. I think you need to look no further than the Final Fantasy VII Remake. They have absolutely no faith in what made the entire series famous. Its JRPG combat is timeless, and while it's not for everyone, it's what created their fan base of millions. Just go check out any of the Final Fantasy sales, especially Final Fantasy VII's. It's insane. Dragon Quest and older Final Fantasies are still revisited to this day with very few complaints. Why would they go to choose, out of all the things in Final Fantasy VII, to reinvent? It just doesn't make sense. I did see that there are some callbacks to the original combat, which was featured in the 2019 E3, but it's still not quite there. The complexities of that game were simply grounded in the choices that you made before combat started, the materia that you combined in the party that you chose, not flashy over-the-top ARPG nonsense. It saddens me to see games like Final Fantasy XII, even though I actually like their MMO-esque Gambit combat, 13 and 15 stray so far from what Final Fantasy is. As if this series was something that they needed to flip upside down to gain more traction. They have so many other games in the series that they can implement ARPG elements to. Not to mention, Bravely Default's and Octopath Traveler's success is just more confirmation of what I am suggesting here. Why try to fix what isn't broken? It's a shame. Final Fantasy X, though featuring some horrific character design, was one of the last great Final Fantasies to feature traditional JRPG combat. Its elegance is in its simplicity. You always knew for the most part whose turn was coming up, and yet it still featured some of the most intense boss battles in Final Fantasy as a whole. In fact, seeing who was going to go next, or being able to manipulate the turns of combat, ended up fostering some great strategic flow. Especially considering Final Fantasy X's success, why change it? Why go from this to this? I mean, I'm not even mentioning Final Fantasy 11 or 14 at this point, but there has been no traditional JRPG Final Fantasy since 2001. 18 years, people. Square's decided that JRPGs are just not what people want, despite two of your most successful franchises having been built upon that type of combat. Dragon Quest has still adhered to its history and roots, which is great for Dragon Quest fans, as I'm sure many of them would be upset by any extreme changes like Final Fantasy has done to its fans. But going a step further, it's not like they haven't introduced some spin-offs that featured varied gameplay. This didn't detract or change the traditions of Dragon Quest. They did this to avoid angering their fan base. That's kind of why companies use spin-offs, to vary gameplay. Flashback to the year 2001, Final Fantasy X just got released and Square is planning their next game. Hey, you know what, let's try something new within the Final Fantasy franchise, but let's not have it as a major title. Bam! Crystal Chronicles. This game ate away so much of my time, and my group of friends adore this game to death. In fact, 8 Melodies on this channel has created a retro review of it on our channel. It didn't make me mad that they changed the core JRPG elements of this series because I knew it wasn't a major entry in the franchise. Crystal Chronicles did such a good job of creating a colorful world filled with character at every turn, the stories that were told every time you entered a zone, the famous monsters that all the fans knew from previous Final Fantasy's populated areas, and it just felt like Final Fantasy. Take a look at the character designs of Crystal Chronicles versus the designs of 15. I know that I've already touched upon character design, but it's just so obvious that there's a disconnect from the Final Fantasies of today to the ones of the past. Let's not neglect to mention that while Square has changed quite a bit since the days of old, so has the gaming industry in general, and I could forgive pushing high-end visuals and reinventing the combat in their games if they stayed away from dirty practices with mobile gaming in the past. Final Fantasy, All the Bravest, is one of the most egregious and disgusting displays from a company, one of the lowest effort games ever produced that rode on the coattails of Final Fantasy's prestige and nostalgia, hoping to get people to pump out cash in absurd amounts. It is what can be described as taking advantage of your fan base in the most disgusting way possible. Not only have you failed as a company to reproduce any of the magic of the older Final Fantasies within the main titles, you're trying to make money off the people who love the older Final Fantasies on a horrific garbage mobile game that barely resembles the older Final Fantasies. They got sprites. That's it. Sprites. The sprites that look like old Final Fantasies. Oh, look, it's Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. Oh, look, it's Celeste from Final Fantasy VI. Square. Why? Okay, so they knew they made a mistake, but then they did it again, just less conspicuously. They released Final Fantasy Record Keeper, which is admittedly a better game overall, But Square still wants to dip its toes? No, I'm sorry. They want to swim in the deep end of mobile market gaming just to get more money. They also made Mobius in a Final Fantasy 15 mobile game that somehow rakes in the cash and finds its way into advertisements everywhere I go. The remakes and the releases, it's so relentless, it never ends. All that has been discussed so far is definitely missing a critical component, and as I close out this video, I want you all to realize that a good bit of this is opinion-based, but there is merit to my complaints. Square Enix was founded as a merging of two companies, Square and Enix, in the year 2003, the point in time where many things were thought to have changed. After Final Fantasy X, which was the last Final Fantasy released before the merge, every complaint that I've mentioned found its footing and gained traction. The time span released between games, the hyper-realism, the dirty mobile practices, distinct character design, and convoluted storytelling all ran rampant. Anyways, before I continue, I've ranted quite a bit and there's still a lot more to unpack. I know that there will be plenty of comments defending all the Final Fantasy games that I've attacked, and I honestly welcome any discussion pertaining all of it. But of all the things, there's definitely one thing that is certain. The way that Final Fantasies are created and designed nowadays is divisive, and it's a shame. Well, that's the video for now. I'm thinking about making a follow-up video and need your help with some discussional matters, so please unload all of your thoughts, criticisms, and anything I may have missed. Hey, my name's Basil, checking out. Super Retro Bros have a lot more content coming your way, so until next time, thanks for watching.